Well, I wanted to take a moment to make a point which should be obvious, but which apparently isn't. And that is that just because something appears in the Bible does not mean that the Bible endorses it. I bring this up because I'm reading through the God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. And as Dawkins tries to make the case that the Bible is actually not a good guide for morality, he spends quite a bit of time talking about some Bible stories which describe horrible things. And he points out, correctly, that the horrible things are horrible. But he appears to have the understanding that by pointing out the horribleness of the horrible stories, he is undermining the morality of the Bible. When in reality, the stories he's talking about are presented to us precisely because they describe awful events. And they're held up to us as object lessons of showing us human nature and what it's capable of, not as a model for us to follow. The particular stories that Dawkins points to are, first of all, out of Genesis 19, the awful story of Lot and the destruction of Sodom, and then following that where Lot commits drunken incest with his daughters. And then also in Judges, where you have Jephthah, the judge who makes a foolish vow to kill the first creature that comes out of his house when he returns from battle, and turns out that the first creature is his own daughter. And he goes and sacrifices her to fulfill his vow. And then finally, perhaps the most grotesque story of all from Judges 19, where you have the degradation and rape of a traveling Levite's concubine. And these are awful stories, but that is exactly the reason that they're shared with us. Because the Bible is quite realistic about human nature. I mean, just page through the daily news, and you'll find stories like this. I mean, this is what man is capable of doing to man. And so there are places in the scriptures where we're given historical stories to illustrate points about human nature. The particular story about Lot is illustrative of the foolish choice Lot made, where he chose to settle in wicked and immoral Sodom and therefore bring that city's culture into his own family. And we see that then bearing fruit in the awful consequences with his own daughters. The story of Judges, the entire book of Judges, is an object lesson in what happens when people do what is right in their own eyes, as Judges often describes it. And so you have this horrible sort of steady downhill collapse of the morals of the Israelite people during those years. And so you have sort of this climax. It's just not building to something good, but building to something awful. As you see through Judges, starting with more righteous judges like Ehud or Deborah and Barak or Gideon, and then sort of collapsing down through Samson and judges who just get more and more morally problematic until you get to the last two stories of Judges, which are stories of just unmitigated disaster morally in every possible way. One of which is this story of the degradation and rape of this concubine, and then the awful consequences that follow from that. And they're held up to us precisely to say, look at this awful mess that human beings make of things when they're left to do what's right in their own eyes. So it's really the height of irony that Dawkins would point to stories like that and say, oh, look, the Bible is not a good moral guide. The Bible is saying, look at this is awful, this is bad. Don't follow this path. Don't live like this. It's not a model, it's a caution. And the lesson for us from this is simply that when you hear somebody bring up something from the Bible, something that sounds bad, might actually be bad. Read the Bible with understanding. Don't be taken in by, this it says this, and that's a bad thing. Well, maybe it's actually intended to be bad, or maybe with a little more context, you can understand it better and see that it's actually not bad. But don't just read the Bible simplistically. Read it with understanding. Look at what this particular story or this particular teaching, how it fits into the broader context. And don't be taken in by those, like Dawkins, who apparently just downloaded a list of awful stories in the Bible off the internet or something and conclude that they understand what the Bible's trying to say. Just because something's in the Bible doesn't mean that the Bible endorsed it.